today's more about having a conversation with all of you. So we've essentially been very lucky to have received 3 years of Arts and Humanities Research Council funding to investigate the way in which blind and visually impaired people use music software, essentially. And we've been doing this for about a year now. We're really fortunate that we have James Cunningham, who's a visually impaired musician, composer, producer. I mean, there's so many things I could add to that list. But he has direct first-hand experience of using DAWs, of accessibility, and he's been it's a real strong influence, I think, on us developing our understanding of that particular workflow as it applies to James and his creative work. But that said, we're only a year in, and we're keen to really have a chat with you all and validate some of our thoughts that we have at this point. So, Bridging the Gap is a collaborative project, and it's led by the Performance Without Barriers Research Group, which is at Queen's University, Belfast. And we're partnered with the Centre for Digital Music at Queen Mary University, and Jacob is from Queen Mary. Really pleased to have him on board. And we have 2 industry partners. So Creative United, we've got Mary Alice in the front here from Creative United, which is a community interest company that supports the growth and development of the arts and creative industries. Fantastic organisation. And then we're also really lucky that we've been collaborating with Ableton as well. So Ableton have very kindly, when we started the project, Jacob was funded for sort of part-time, but Ableton has stepped in and funded an extra 50% of Jacob's time, so he's able to work full-time on the project. So thanks very much to Ableton for that. And one more thing I wanted to kind of stress is that this is an academic project rather than a commercial one. And what that does, it brings flexibility. I guess, we're not sort of tied down to meeting any particular market demands. We're all about seeking new knowledge and, most importantly, sharing that knowledge openly. So, we don't have any secrets. We're completely transparent, and we want to kind of share that knowledge with the VIB community and with industry as well. So I'm going to start with a bit of jargon busting before we go. So some of you will probably be very familiar with these terms, but we've opted for the acronym VIB, so visually impaired and blind. I know BVI is used in some parts of the world, but we've stuck with VBI. And we talk a lot about screen reader technology. So those of you who are not familiar with this method of interacting with computers, it's essentially I guess it's an assistant, it's an aid, it's a way of interacting with a computer using a QWERTY keyboard, and the features and functionalities of software applications are described using a synthesized voice. So there are a few different variants, a few different flavors of screen readers, depending on the platform that you're working with. We also use the catch-all term of sound creatives. So that includes producers, audio engineers, composers, musicians. I mean, a lot of people kind of straddle between these definitions as well, but really anyone who's working creatively with sound. And then lastly, we'll be talking about DAWs or DAWs, digital audio workstations. So, yeah, I guess we had some goals at the start of the research. We wanted to understand the workflows of VIB sound creatives using DAWs, identify common access barriers, if there are any. I mean, that was perhaps a bit of an assumption of ours at the beginning of the project, that there are access barriers in that particular workflow. And identify sort of new ways in which technology can support VIB sound creatives in professional practice. So this is really the gap that we want to bridge. We felt that potentially, due to the differences in tools available to VIB sound creatives and to their sighted counterparts, there's a bit of an equality issue in terms of employment. So that's something that we wanted to help to try and address. To help open our research to scrutiny, so this is a goal of the symposium, there is a Miro board which you can access online. So the link for that is tiny.1/BTG-Miro. The second goal, like I mentioned before, really is to we want you to help shape what we do next. And I'd like to kind of really encourage you throughout today, to kind of think about what you would do next. So what would you do next if you had access to a team of software and hardware developers? What would you do next if you were the CEO of Universal Records? What would you do next if you were setting up an educational facility for young VIB sound creatives who are looking to get into to develop their professional practice? So yeah, what would you do? Please think about that. And lastly, and most importantly, it's an opportunity for us to just connect with each other and get to know each other and build this community. Yeah, sure. So it's tiny.1/BTG-Miro. Miro is it's an online sort of, how would you describe it, James? You've had a bit of an experience with it, but it's
like a virtual sort of whiteboard idea collation thing. It's M-I-R-O, Miro.
Yeah, so we got it. Okay, great stuff. So yeah, it's I mean, designers are really keen on post-it notes. So this is like a virtual post-it note environment. So typically that's quite a visual way of laying out ideas, but for the most part we found that it's screen reader friendly. So, but if you have any issues, then please do let me know. Oh, sorry. Stuff, thank you. Slight adjustment here. Great stuff. So just to quickly whip through some of our initial research questions. So we are interested in which usability and accessibility issues are inherent in controlling music production software with a screen reader. And that's based on an assumption that there is a distinct difference between usability and accessibility. And this is something that we kind of tie ourselves in knots in sometimes when we're having a chat as a group. So we'd like to kind of speak to you a little bit further about that today. We're interested in how tactile control surfaces might improve usability and accessibility of music production software. We're interested in whether visually impaired sound creatives experience a greater degree of cognitive load when operating DAWs in comparison to their sighted counterparts. So really based on the assumption that the screen reader workflow is arduous. I mean, that's something that I assumed, I think, at the beginning of the research project, but I'm not sure I necessarily still feel that is the case. Last question is, how do linear ways of accessing software parameters, so scrolling through menu parameters, item by item, how does that kind of inform or change the creative flow of the music production process? So, what effect does this mode of interaction have on our creativity, on our creative output? So we ran a contextual inquiry, which is a practice-based interview, and we held it with about sort of 20 people. It wasn't a statistics-based study. It was more of a deep dive, what we call a thick description, really trying to understand individual workflows in context. And based on that, we're performing an analysis, a thematic analysis, to draw out key themes which we find are quite interesting or relevant to our questions. And then we took part in a concept mapping exercise with each participant as well. So this is a visual technique which we adapted to a non-visual workflow. And we asked each of our participants, what is a DAW and what does it offer? I think I'm going to stop there, just in the interest of time, and hand over to James, who's going to kind of tell us a little bit about what we've learned so far. So over to you, James.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Ooh, hello. Hearing myself is always interesting. So I'm James. I'm a PhD student at Queen's University, and I'm helping Alex and Jacob with the project. So coming out of our research, having conducted these contextual inquiries that Alex talked about, there's a few sort of insights that we wanted to highlight. We had in our set of participants, we had a reasonably good spread internationally, although maybe tending a bit towards sort of the global north. We had South Africa, Singapore, Switzerland, the States, UK, all covered. And one thing that this really highlighted for us was how stigma is viewed across the world. one of our participants from Eastern Europe told us that they really felt there was a difference between how VIP folk are viewed in their country and, for instance, the UK, and how that can really affect things like education, job opportunities, social infrastructure, that sort of thing. And we also had another participant in the USA, and they sort of described to us a very unfortunate experience at their college where they were made to feel very separate and not given the sort of support that they needed to participate fully. And that, for us, I think really highlighted that just because someone grows up, lives, and is educated in a country where resources and infrastructure shouldn't be a problem, doesn't mean that lived experience aligns with that presupposition. And I think it's really important for us to keep that in mind when we're thinking about, trying to find ways to improve accessibility. We also had a really good spread of age in our participants, sort of early 20s right through to beyond. I'll be polite. And one thing this really highlighted for us was this transition that sort of happened a couple of decades ago from analog to digital. Some of our more senior participants talked to us about how they felt something was really lost there, about how an emphasis on using your ears to mix in a studio, for example, was gone, but also how learning happened. We had people learning music from tapes and getting, instruction in Braille, and also, the cutting and the sticking and the splicing, the razor blades, the adhesive glue, and tape and all of that sort of stuff, which is all very tactile, along with all of the, the mixing desks where the EQ high cut is always an EQ high cut, and every knob and every button does the thing, and you can feel where it is and adjust the value. And whenever everything moved into the box, into the computer, they felt that was lost. And so I thought that was really important. One of our research questions is to do with tactility and haptics, and that's something we might want to try and capture moving forward in design. So having a look at the tech, we had 3 screen readers covered, primarily 2. So many of our users were Mac OS users, and a Mac OS VoiceOver is the one and only screen reader available, and it's integrated with the architecture. And so there are no other options there. And then with our Windows users, we had mostly NVDA, which is a free screen reader, and then JAWS, which is a screen reader for millionaires. So I think it's important to bear in mind that sort of there isn't a great plethora of options for screen readers, and so whenever we're trying to design something, especially in the digital space, it's good to bear in mind that might be a limitation depending on what features are available with those screen readers. DAWs, we had mostly Reaper. Again, a lot to do with cost, I think, but also versatility. And then we had Logic Pro and Pro Tools, and we had one case of Samplitude as well, which is really exciting. And Sonar, I forgot Sonar. I think one thing that we discovered here was that many DAWs fill specific roles in different spheres. So a couple of our participants spoke to us about how in their field in audio production, they felt like Pro Tools was really like an industry standard, and they felt that they needed to use that software to have a career, to be professional. We also talked to somebody who makes sort of underground electronic music, and in their field, Ableton Live is very much the sort of standard in that community. And because Ableton Live at the moment is not accessible for screen readers, they have to use Logic instead. And they very much feel excluded in that regard. They're not able to work on the same level as their peers, and that's, I think, directly a result of an access barrier, right? The tech not being able to do what it's supposed to do. So moving from screen readers and DAWs, we start to expand into this really complicated ecosystem of stuff that VIB folks have hacked together for all their personal workflows. So I'm sure a lot of you know about the NKS protocol and Native Instruments' complete control keyboards. This allows for screen reader friendly access to lots of plugins. some that are already accessible out of the box, and some that need third-party libraries purchased and installed to sort of help the plugin along a bit. And this is really good. It allows for that tactility to return again, right? On the sort of complete control MIDI keyboard interface, we can touch knobs and hear parameters. We can then, adjust those parameters to get more fine control over, the sound and the effects. But also, aside from one other product, that really is the only way to do that in that specific way, and that creates a financial barrier, right? Because you have to buy a keyboard, and then if you want something that's not made by Native Instruments, if you want Keyscape by Spectrasonics, then you have to go and buy the library, the NKS and compatibility. We also have things like optical character recognition. A couple of our participants describe that as being really essential to their workflow. And if you don't know what that is essentially a program that scans the screen for text and then makes that text available to a screen reader whenever the interface is not already accessible. And this came up quite a lot in setup windows and wizards, which seem to be very broadly neglected by manufacturers. There were lots of other little things. We had braille displays. We had PPS meters. But all these hardware and software solutions sort of tie together to create this ecosystem that can really has a couple of issues. One, system updates are a nightmare. Yeah, exactly, yeah. Things work at different versions. Accessibility sometimes just completely disappears. We've had several of our participants use like Windows 7, right, or using really old versions of Mac OS because the accessible versions of the software that they use only function there. And so that is something that really needs to be kept in mind. One thing that we expected to be an issue was this idea of cognitive load, right? Trying to manage lots of different systems together, create models in your head, memorize all the keyboard shortcuts. But really that didn't come up in the interviews a lot. I think most of our participants seemed to not find that an issue. I think that was something that was really sort of insightful for us. So there's quite a few people here, I think, today from the WhatsApp groups. We have these self-organized communities of VIB sound creatives sort of on WhatsApp and mailing lists. And most of our participants told us that they were members of these groups. We heard lots of positive things. They were really encouraging. For people, especially some of our newer participants who were new to making music, they were able to get support, ask questions. And also it was a great place for some people to share their music as well, to get promoted. We had a couple of more experienced creators in those groups who talked to us about having a sense of duty to share their knowledge. And this is a really good sort of self-perpetuating education system in the lack of any sort of real framework created by an institution or something. But it's really important, I think, to highlight here that our data set, I suppose you would call it, is a little skewed because most of our participants came to us through calls distributed through these communities. So, obviously they're going to mention those communities because they're a part of them. So I think we'd be keen in the future to maybe see if there are any other alternatives. Jay Pocknell, I think, is here with Sound Without Sight, which is, he's trying to create like a sort of collated database of information and resources for VAB sound creatives, which is also a great option. So the last thing I have to say is whenever I was conducting most of these interviews, I asked all of the participants a question at the end, which was, do you, in your field as a VIB sound creative, feel disadvantaged compared to somebody who is sighted who does the same tasks as you? And we got really mixed responses. Some people said, yes, absolutely, I feel disadvantaged. There are access barriers that I cannot overcome. It makes me slower, it makes me less efficient, and things need to change for that to happen. We had some people who said, yes and no. Yes, obviously there are access barriers in place, but also no, and they felt, generally quite positive about the outlook and about their own process. And then a couple of our participants were very very positive in saying, no, I don't feel disadvantaged at all. In fact, sometimes I even feel more efficient because my workflow is so specialized, and I have the tools I need that I can sometimes work, at a greater pace and to a greater standard than some of my contemporaries. I think that was really important for us because it highlights two things, right? One, work needs to be done, right? People in these communities are working with manufacturers. We're becoming activists. We're trying to promote change, but also there is a lot of hope for the future. Change is happening, and it's happening a lot these days. Companies, Avid, Arturia, Native Instruments, Softube, are all making steps forward, and information is becoming more and more available and organized for folks. And we have lots of options for the future for finding new ways to promote accessibility. And I think Jacob is going to talk to you about that. So,
great. Thanks, James. Hi, everyone. My name's Jacob. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Queen Mary University. So we're partnering with Queen's University Belfast on the Bridging the Gap project. Before I start, I just wanted to quickly mention that we have a couple of volunteers here as well to help us out throughout the day. So Evie and Adan are here, and also Francisca and Mary Alice. If you need any assistance with moving around the venue and you can't find one of us, then we've got a few extra people here. So just to let you know about that. And also thanks very much to Evie and Adan for volunteering their time to help us out today. Woo! Yeah. So I'm going to talk a bit about the future of the Bridging the Gap project. We're at quite an exciting point. It's still relatively early days. We've completed our first study and sort of still in the process of analysing what we found from that, and we're now kind of thinking about what to do next. So there's a number of things that we're hoping to do as part of the project. Now that we've got an amazing amount of insights from our interview participants, we're going to try and understand where those barriers exist in people's workflows, and as Alex pointed out, if those barriers exist, and the nature of those barriers. We're then hoping to sort of think about developing potentially new tools and new processes and ways of working which might help to address those barriers. And something we're really keen on doing as part of this process is using participatory and co-design methods to ensure that whatever our designs become actually reflect the values and goals of the people that we're working with. So once we've come up with some new and interesting designs, we would then hope to evaluate them and share our findings so that other researchers and organisations can build on our findings. Obviously, it's a 3-year project, and we want to make sure there's some longevity to what we're doing. And hopefully, through that process, we can help introduce some more accessible tools to the VIB music making community. So what kind of tools are we thinking of developing? So at this stage, we're quite flexible. We've got a number of options, a number of different routes that we can go down. We might think about developing some software which enhances or extends screen reader technology, or even designing a new software tool from scratch. For example, we might ask ourselves the question, what would a door designed with VIB users in mind be like? We're also really interested in developing hardware. So for a lot of the people that we spoke to, the tactile nature of hardware provided obvious advantages. So we're interested in leveraging that mode of tactility in our new designs. So a sentiment that's come up a couple of times in our interviews is the sort of stark difference between analog and digital studios. Before everything was done via a screen, studios were actually more accessible in a lot of ways, as James mentioned, in the sense that hardware and mixing desks tend to be very tactile, as well as predictable and consistent in the way that they function. So how might we design new hardware which can take the best of both worlds, between the flexibility offered by a modern door, but with the tactility and consistency of an analog studio? Really not a very easy task, but something that would be really interesting to explore, I think. Another avenue that we're interested in exploring is the use of haptic feedback. So what do we mean by haptics? So haptics broadly is generally defined as the process of transmitting and understanding information through the sense of touch. But when people talk about haptic technology, they're usually referring to kind of active haptic feedback. So for example, things which move or vibrate to provide feedback to the user, rather than fixed objects like printed braille or tactile markers. So a haptic device could be something that uses motors or transducers to provide physical feedback, either via broad movements, like with a motorized fader, or more subtle sensations like the vibration on a phone or the touchpads on modern laptops. So how might we incorporate haptics into door accessibility? The advantages of using haptics are that it doesn't require an additional channel of audio to attend to. So haptic feedback, at least in theory, can be used to convey information while the user can pay their full attention on audio signals from the door or software instrument. And we definitely wouldn't be the first people to explore this idea from a VIB accessibility perspective. So previous research projects have included a fader which can scrub through an audio signal and provide haptic feedback to simulate the amplitude of the waveform. This was called the Haptic Wave Project, if you haven't come across it. So that's one example, but we might also use haptics to provide feedback when navigating through musical material, such as audio waveforms, MIDI notes, or automation curves, or it could even be something a little simpler, such as for navigating menus and windows, for example, by providing feedback on the progress through a list while scrolling, or to indicate that a particular item has been selected or a border between tracks or clips has been crossed. So lots of potential ways of incorporating haptics. So that's just a few examples of the avenues we might explore over the next couple of years of the Bridging the Gap project. But it's really important to note, and Alex has already mentioned this as well, that part of the reason we've organised this event today, relatively near the beginning of the project, is to get your thoughts on kind of what needs our focus and give you the chance to sort of steer and shape the direction of our research. So please do be honest and don't hold back on what you think of our ideas. It's also important to consider what issues we might come against when designing new tools to augment or enhance people's existing workflows. So a lot of the people that we talk to could be described as power users, or other people that we spoke to have used very tried and tested methods shared by some of the online communities that we're going to hear about more today. So in developing new tools, we need to be sensitive to the fact that people have invested a lot of time and effort into mastering and developing the existing tools, and the investment required in learning an entirely new way of doing things might not be worth the cost. So there's a sort of balance to be struck there. And related to this, we also want to think about how well new tools integrate with existing software, which presents its own set of challenges, but it's definitely worth doing, considering the importance of using industry standard software for a lot of the people that we spoke to. And this also relates to what James was saying about using the same software as your peers might be using for a particular genre or style of music. So there's just some of the things that we're going to be thinking about for the future of the Bridging the Gap project. And yeah, I'm going to hand back over to Alex now.
Great. Thanks so much, Jacob and James. So really that's our project in a nutshell so far. So maybe now is a really good point perhaps to pause for any questions. So does anyone have anything they'd like to ask us at this point at all? Yes, yeah, Maya. Hi.
I have a question about more about the event itself.
Sure.
I know that our presentations and discussions are available online, and I want to ask if it will be recorded.
So will the event? Sorry, Maya, I cut you off. So will it be recorded so that we can watch later? It will be, yes, yeah. So we're recording the live stream at the moment with the audio, and we're also recording footage in the room today, which reminds me, if anyone would prefer not to be recorded or have photos taken of them, please just either raise your hand now or come and have a chat to me after this presentation. That's no problem at all. Okay, that's great. Thank you. Great stuff. Well, any more questions at all at this point? Brian, hi.
Thank you. Yeah, I was really interested by what you were saying about the ideas for sort of hardware that might provide some of that tactility that to blend with the sort of digital interfaces that exist. Are you aware of any examples of that are already in existence, that you sort of might develop from?
Yeah, Jacob, did you want to take that one? I think you've got a couple of ideas about this.
Yeah, so there's a few great examples of hardware controllers that are becoming more and more screen reader compatible. So products from Arturia and Novation. They definitely headed in the right direction in terms of at least making the physical controls present themselves to screen readers, and therefore slightly more understandable than a sort of generic MIDI device, which any knob could be assigned to any number of controls, and it's difficult to know what it's doing unless it can speak to you. So I think sort of building on that idea would be one way forward. I think the thing about the sort of predictability and consistency of analog mixing desk is something that could potentially be brought into sort of hardware devices. At the moment, there's kind of a focus on, with things like the Ableton Push, it's capable of doing any number of things, but it's very sort of contextual, and depending on what's currently on screen will determine what each sort of knob or fader does. And so it might just be a case of modifying the behavior of existing controllers so that they maintain a bit more consistency and predictability. But yeah, that's my thoughts so far.
There is also, I think, a couple of projects that had been started up that maybe haven't seen much publicity yet, and I've sort of struggled with things like funding. One that I'd recommend you all look into is the Haptic Wave, which was an attempt to create a hardware device that would allow VIB sound creatives to manipulate EQ and also work with, the haptic EQ does the EQ, right?
Yeah, that's
Haptic
right.
Wave is for waveform editing.
Yeah.
I think they saw quite a lot of success, but again, they had a bit of trouble within the project getting the hardware off the ground after like the initial prototyping, which is another problem I think we face when we're trying to design new tools, especially in such a niche area like combining, digital music making with VIB accessibility. So I'd recommend you go and have a look at that as well. I think it was designed so that you would take whatever you wanted to work on out of the DAW and into the device, and then work completely on the device, and then re-import back into the DAW what you had edited, which is, an interesting workflow.
Yeah, I think there's two things there that we're particularly interested in, and Jacob mentioned this as well, was kind of, I suppose, integration into existing workflows. We've seen some workflows which are very highly tailored to individuals, but highly effective as well. And the last thing we want to do is kind of disrupt that particular effective workflow. So we're keen to integrate. But we're also keen to ensure that anything that we develop has life after the project. It's a challenge really with academic projects generally, is that they're sort of funded for, usually 3 years, if you're lucky, perhaps a little bit longer. But what happens to the knowledge, what happens to the technology after that point is a real challenge. And I think it's something that the academics behind the Haptic Wave is a challenge that they've faced as well. So we don't necessarily have the answer to that at the moment. I think certainly everything that we develop will be released as open source, but our feeling is we really need to go a step further. It's all very well sharing the technical details, but sort of implementing those, constructing hardware, for instance, requires a slightly deeper dialogue, I think, with the people who originally developed that technology. So that's something that we're really thinking about. So, okay. Well, we'll leave that there for now, just in the interest of time. So we're just going to take a couple of minutes, and we've got a really exciting keynote from Scott Chesworth next. So Scott will be delivering his keynote remotely, but I'm really excited to say that he'll be here in person, giving a demo later on this afternoon. So yeah, feel free to chat amongst yourselves and grab a coffee if you need to, or a tea, and we'll just get that set up. Thanks very much.
Yeah.